Well, I would invite everybody to turn in their Bibles to the book of Genesis and the 25th chapter for our study tonight. For those of you who may not be aware, we have recently begun, for the summer months, a study through the Old Testament. We are by no means going to try to cover every part of the Old Testament. We are going to try to at least focus on some of the key events through each of the main periods of Old Testament history. And we started out in our first lesson looking at the account of creation. Then we looked at Genesis chapters 3 through 11 and noted especially the consequences of man's sin. And that fits in with the fact that the real story of the Bible is the story of the redemption of man from sin. Then, last Sunday night, we looked especially at Genesis 12 and some succeeding chapters, but especially Genesis 12, where we read about the promise that God made to Abraham. And man's sin, of course, had brought man under the curse of sin and the sentence of death. And the promise that God made to Abraham, that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed, is really the promise that is ultimately fulfilled in Christ and the salvation from sin that he brings us. Well, the first part of the book of Genesis is largely dominated by the character Abraham. And I suppose if I were to ask who is the main character in the book of Genesis, who is the one that we learn the most about, probably most of us would think of Abraham. But interestingly, there are more chapters in the book of Genesis that are devoted not to Abraham, but to his grandson Jacob than any other character in the book of Genesis. And tonight, we're going to look especially at the character of Jacob for our lesson. Now, most of the lessons that I'm presenting are lessons that really come just straight out of some things that I do teaching in school, class in Old Testament history and geography there. But tonight's lesson, though composed in part of some things that we talk about at school, is really a little bit different. It's really just focusing on the character of Jacob. Because while Abraham is, of course, the father of the faithful, as we think of him from the New Testament, it is not Abraham that the nation of Israel is named for. It is rather named for his grandson Jacob. We know, of course, that Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And even in the case of Isaac, it was some years before any children were born to him. And we pick up here in Genesis chapter 25, and I'd like to start reading with you in verse 19.